Welcome back, everybody, to this lecture within the Summer Institute in Machine Learning in Economics. We are very fortunate to have Susan Athey today. Susan Athey is my colleague here at Stanford, and she's also director of the Golub Capital Social Impact Lab. She has made a lot of early important contributions to bringing machine learning into economics. And today we'll talk specifically about adaptive experiments. Susan, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate all the effort that went into planning this event, and I'm really glad that it's taking place. And I have a fair number of resources that you can find on my website, as well as linked through the Golub Capital Social Impact Lab at Stanford. And feel free to contact me for more resources as well. We've actually worked hard on putting them together, and they are designed for your benefit. Actually, I'm going to update. I realized that one of my links, I didn't save my update on it. So you can check out my personal website, my lab website. A couple years ago, we did a 2-day mini course at the AEA, and the videos are there, as well as a link to a directory. And we have an R Markdown book that has a lot of materials there, except I have the rough draft of it there instead of the final one, so I'll fix that afterwards. And just broadly, a lot of the methods that I've been working on recently, fit into a lot of the themes of this whole week: heterogeneous treatment effects, targeted treatment assignment policies, a few others that are I won't be able to talk about today, but you might be interested in things like combining experimental and observational data. That's something that comes up a lot in when trying to use machine learning in practice, because a lot of times with machine learning or adaptive experiments, like I'm going to talk about today, there's a problem that you want to get feedback quickly and update your algorithms quickly. And in that context, you therefore often can't wait to measure the thing you really care about, and you have to use short-term outcomes as well, called surrogates. So I have some work with Hito Mbinza and Raj Chetty and Hyun-Sung Chang on this. You can check out. One of the things that's been really interesting about the modern era of using statistics and to build things and to make things better is that we actually have figured out that experiments and experimental design are a much more interesting science than you thought. So I think that I probably would have been kind of dismissive of experiments as certainly as an interesting econometric topic. I said, well, with an RCT, everything's easy. You just take means and you're done. So what's interesting? What could possibly be interesting about experiments? And when I first went to Microsoft in 2007 and was working on the search engine, one of the first things I realized was that actually, no, experimentation was a science with many, many unanswered questions. Everything from how to share control groups across many different treatments, how to deal with different types of persistence, how to design experiments when there's interactions among the units in the experiments. Those were all immediate things that I saw immediately as needing attention. How to plan experiments if you're going to try to do a personalization or reuse the data afterwards. Another thing that I did a lot and I see a lot over the last 15 years in tech firms is staggered rollouts. So how do you design an experiment if you have a relatively small number of units, like cities or hospitals or schools, and there's a lot of time variation? How do you actually plan an experiment to not release the treatment at the same time everywhere to optimize for statistical power? So those are all questions. I won't be able to talk about the work I've been doing on staggered rollouts today, just in the interest of time, but these are all topics that actually have lots of open questions. There's lots and lots to do. And the exciting thing is, because we're now, the economist is sort of an engineer who's embedded in a system, we have the chance to design much more complex experiments at large scale. And this is true, it's obvious in search engines, or if you do a summer internship for a tech firm, a big tech firm, you'll see this up front, but it's also going to be really important for, for schools, for governments, for healthcare, because we're in the end, we're going to be digitally interacting with people in all of these different settings. And so if the economist isn't sort of there, part of the engineering team, working on how to set things up to do good experiments, we will really miss out on a lot of opportunities. And so that's some motivation for all of this work. Some of the applications I've been working on include nudges. So with Jan, we've been working on some stuff about nudging people to take financial aid. Charitable giving. I have large experiments running where you're trying to get people to give at checkout. Health decisions, educational technology. We've been actually running a lot of experiments and planning a bunch more around things like misinformation, voter information, or vaccine hesitancy, where we're designing and running chatbot experiments through platforms like Facebook. So these are all different applications where these techniques might be useful. So what I'm going to focus on today is designing adaptive experiments, just a piece of all of this. And I'm going to start out with another application that through a project that Jan and I worked on with Ideas 42. This work was also joined with Vitor Haddad, one of my postdocs. So in this experiment, what we wanted to do was to help the New York City Department of Finance design treatments that would try to get people to pay their parking tickets. Now, you might not think that trying to get people to pay their parking tickets is really important for social impact, but it turns out that it can be a really important problem to solve, because if somebody's car gets booted and towed, they're now going to have to pay to get it back. Actually, I remember when I first started teaching at MIT, I one time overslept the street cleaning, and I had to take a taxi to go and get my car out of being booted. And so it takes time. You have to take off work, and you have to pay high fees. So if you can get people to set up a payment plan ahead of time, that can be beneficial for them. And so here's just some examples of some of the types of emails we're talking about here. So on the left was sort of the standard email that had been sent by the New York City Department of Finance to try to get people to pay their fines. The other kinds of prototypes we were considering were prototypes where you would make it easier for people to find the links to take action. And then other versions of that would have personalization. So it would sort of show in the email that, like, we know who you are. This isn't just a mass email, although of course it is a mass email and it is just generated by a computer. But the question is whether having some personal information in it somehow makes you take it more seriously. So those are the types of interventions we were considering in this experiment. Now, if we had lots of different possibilities for an email, and just something like an email is a good example of where there could be lots of different treatments, because you think about it, there's many components of the email. There's like, how the information is presented. There's whether or not it's personalized. Each component could have different language. They could have different subject lines. So there's lots and lots of possibilities for an email campaign. Now, if I did a very standard approach to this, I might just run a 10-armed randomized controlled trial with equal weights on each arm. So what is wrong with this as a design? Well, one problem is it's going to require a large sample size because I've got 10 arms. And if you think about what problem does a 10-armed equal weight RCT solve, it's basically going to result in a priori or equal variance for each of the arms. But afterwards, you're going to look back and realize that you actually wasted a lot of data, because you may have gathered a lot of data about bad arms which ultimately aren't going to be used. And you might have more precision than you need on arms that aren't going to be very interesting from the perspective of choosing a policy later. So it's helpful to step back and say, well, what would be my goals from running an experiment? What would I want to do when I'm done? I might want to know whether, like, any arm is better than control. I might want to think about, I'm going to use one of these arms later, and so I just want to maximize the value of the best arm. Or I might actually just, if I might want to care about the people in the experiment. Maybe I'm always in an experiment. You can think of some tech firms as always being in a process of experiments. So they just sort of care about the flow utility of people that are in an experiment because the experiment never ends. You just maybe you keep throwing in more arms or the world is changing. So it's useful to step back and think, what is my point here? And while and if you were, say, a behavioralist or a psychologist, you might actually be interested in testing other types of hypotheses. So you might want to say, well, is one type of treatment better than the other, even if none of them are good? Or you might try to get at mechanisms. So generally, stepping back and saying, what is my goal, can then help with the design of the experiment. In this case, we were mostly interested in just finding a good arm, finding something that was going to be beneficial and getting people to pay their fines, and something that we could show would be better than the control, so we could know that it was worthwhile. There's also some other types of complications which can come up. So some of these emails may be harder to program than others, or might involve more privacy considerations than others. So you also might care whether an arm is sufficiently better than another arm if certain costs are involved in implementing some of these. So let's think about what happens in an adaptive experiment. So, and that's called a bandit, multi-armed bandit. So in the first step of an adaptive experiment, you would do a purely randomized, you do pure randomization, and you would put the same number of observations into each treatment. But the difference comes as the experiment progresses. So as the experiment progresses, after some data has been collected, what you then do is you can increase the probability of assignment to more promising arms. And I should say, I'll talk about different algorithms here. So I'm assuming that you're using an algorithm, one of the most popular algorithms, which is generally trying to care about the best arms or minimize regret. So I'll come back to that. But for now, I'm just showing you an example of how one would work. And after the first batch, you would increase the number of units going to the good arms and decrease the incremental units going to the bad arm. And so you can see over on the right, for the good arm, now that it's gotten lots more observations, it has a tight confidence interval around its value, while the bad arms have less data associated with them and wider confidence intervals. You keep repeating this over and over again until at the end of the experiment, we've been loading up quite a bit of data on the top arm. So we know quite precisely how good it is. So we don't just know that it's good, but we also understand its value very well. While the bad arms, we know they're bad, but we don't really know exactly how valuable they are. So we have wide confidence intervals on the bad arms and tight confidence intervals on the good arms. And so what would the advantage of this be is that at the end of this, we could go back to a partner and say, hey, we've got this arm and we're pretty confident how well it works. And so we really understand this arm well. We've collected a lot of data about it. There's very little risk in using this arm. And we're also pretty sure it's the best arm. And by the fact that we've allocated more data to the top two arms, we're also more confident in being able to distinguish arm one and arm two. Well, if the data had been equally allocated, we might have a harder time telling apart arm one and arm two as well. So that's basically the idea of an adaptive experiment. That's how it's going to work. And those are some of the benefits it's going to have. It's also going to have the benefit that during the experiment, the overall welfare is higher than it would be if I had a equal distribution. So for example, if you look at this compared to if I had allocated the observations equally, a lot of units are getting a really good arm and not very many units are getting a very bad arm. So overall, the utility of the people in the experiment on average is higher from this type of experiment. So it's got a bunch of these potential advantages. During the experiment, people are better off. Maybe it's more ethical or more profitable, depending on what it is you're trying to maximize. And it's also going to do a better job in understanding the best arms, the ones that are candidates for being chosen. So seems like a no-brainer. So we should just do these all the time, right? Well, actually, no. And I'll talk about some of the complications about using these with within the rest of the lecture. So let me now go in. I'm going to explain a little bit more about a couple of the algorithms and how they actually work. How would you actually design an algorithm to run such an experiment? So I'm going to start with Thompson sampling, which is a very common algorithm, and I think it's one that's sort of very intuitive as well. So Thompson sampling is based on sort of a Bayesian approach to all of this. So what you do is you start out with a prior distribution on ARM values, and you have to specify that as the analyst, although you usually pick a kind of a diffuse prior. Then you collect a first batch of data by assigning treatments uniformly at random. So just this first picture on the left is showing an example of what the priors might look like, where your prior is that, equal priors that each arm is optimal and they all have the same prior mean. After you observe the first batch of outcomes, you update the posterior distribution. And so this second illustration shows, what things might look like after collecting some data. We might see different posteriors depending both on how much data we've collected so far, as well as the mean value from what we've collected so far. And then what the Thompson sampling heuristic does is it at every stage, so you're going to keep doing this over and over again, so you're going to have batches. So after you collect a batch of data, you update these posteriors. And then you're going to calculate from that data the probability each arm is optimal. So if you look at this picture above, although arm one has arm two has the orange one has the highest mean. And so you can see there's going to be a lot of probability mass associated with arm two being the highest, but it's not necessarily the best. And you can see that there's also a fair bit of probability mass where, say, arm three is optimal. And arm three has in this picture, the posterior variance is pretty wide. Maybe we haven't collected as much data about that arm. And so even though arm three has a lower mean, since we haven't collected enough data, there's still some chance that it could be the best arm. And so the Thompson sampling heuristic dictates that in the next batch, you assign treatments randomly, but with in proportion to the probability that the arm is highest. Now, if you haven't seen this before, you might be asking, like, wow, how did they come up with this? Like, how can that be right? How does the math work out so beautifully that this is like the perfect answer? And the answer is that no, it's not that this is a heuristic. It's not actually necessarily the best thing. We don't know that. It's not obvious by looking at it. But instead, there's a whole theoretical literature around this that shows that, under some conditions and as you take certain limits, that this heuristic works well. And actually, there's a whole bunch of definitions of what it means to work well and different ways to analyze whether it works well or not. So when I'm waving my hands a little bit at that, I'm not just insulting your intelligence. I'm just saying there's many papers that have been written with different ways to compare algorithms that would say that Thompson sampling works well. So there's different aspects of what it means to work well. One is like, well, what limit am I taking, and what are my assumptions? But another aspect of what it means to work well is what is your objective? And so most of the literature on bandits is written around the objective of minimizing regret or maximizing the utility of the people in the experiment. And so this algorithm in particular works well at maximizing the utility of the people in the experiment. Okay. And so why would it do that? Well, if I just want to maximize utility, why don't I just give everybody the best arm? But of course, if I gave everybody the best arm today, then the people who come tomorrow would still get that arm and we would never learn. So this heuristic is going to balance the exploration-exploitation trade-off. Exploitation means I want to give people the thing I think is best today. So on average, it looks like arm two is best. So exploitation would say, I want to give everybody arm two. But exploration says, hey, there's some chance that, arm three is actually a better arm. And I just have got bad luck with my initial draws of arm three. And so the exploration says, hey, I'm going to sacrifice the unit who's come today in order to benefit the units that come tomorrow. Okay, and so I'm going to explore so that tomorrow I can give more, I can give better decisions tomorrow. So that's basically the way that a multi-arm bandit works. So let me pause there and ask for any questions about that, because this is everything else I'm going to do. It's going to kind of build on using bandits.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone has questions, please put them in. I was wondering, the way we've talked about it so far seems to be all kind of in a ultimately static environment where none of the outcomes would kind of change over time. How do you know, is there much work thinking about these issues in settings where we believe that the treatment effect we estimated on last month's data might be different, or the outcome mean might be different from the means that we are estimating in a couple of months? So to kind of follow those changes, we need potentially more kind of spread out weights throughout, because the old data becomes less accurate about current things.
Yeah, so so there's a bunch of different generalizations of these things. So instability is one of the unstable environment is one of the most common things you encounter in practice. So generally, yes. What you typically do is you just discount older data and put more weight on newer data. And if you do that, then in principle, you're uncertain. As long as you've kind of specified that part correctly, you can still use something like a Thompson sampling heuristic, because you are accurately understanding your uncertainty. Now, if you thought about this, if you come from like an economics perspective where you're used to sort of fully solving problems, you would think that the algorithms should depend on more stuff, because like in the future, if the world's changing, then maybe I don't care about the distant future very much and I want to exploit more. So there's kind of, there's a few different competing effects. Like you might want to explore more because you're not confident that the past informs the present, but on the other hand, you might not care as much about the future. So the way most of the extensions to these algorithms stick with similar heuristics and just sort of change the way that you think about uncertainty and modeling. But I think that kind of reveals that these heuristics are imperfect and they're not actually fully optimized to the situation. So you kind of have, when you go into machine learning, you get used to this, that a lot of times people are satisfied with solutions that are sort of good enough, even though you're like, well, how could it possibly be that you're ignoring this crucially important force? But then it turns out that simple things often work pretty well, and so there's more of an emphasis on getting stuff to be good enough rather than being perfect.
Thank you. That's quite helpful. I think we also have a question from Anna. Would you like to ask your question, Anna?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you think about this when you start to have treatment heterogeneity and you can potentially start sort of adapting and splitting by subgroups and so on and so forth. Obviously, that gets complicated really fast, but have you started looking at that for this work?
Yes. So let me come to that. I've actually got 6 or 7 papers myself on this topic, but I would say that if you look at them, you might be disappointed at how well we or anyone else has actually fully solved this problem, despite the fact that that was when I first started working on this problem 5 or 6 years ago. At first I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. And then after just thinking about it for a month or two, I thought it was going to be impossible. And so now it seems like maybe it's a little more somewhere in between. One of the things that makes all of this really complicated, IID data, like a lot of the econometrics that I knew and loved was putting a lot of emphasis on IID data. And so when you're designing a Bandit algorithm, it's a really complicated function because it's a mapping from all of the past data to an allocation today. And so actually, if you think about an experiment with 100 batches, your algorithm actually has 100 different treatment assignments, and each of those depends on all of the past data. So it's a pretty complex data generating process, and coming up with an algorithm design that tells you what to do at each stage is a very complex and multidimensional optimization problem. So that's partly like oh my God, this is impossible. Like this is just, we're never going to be able to do theory about this. And so I've been kind of surprised. And frankly, it's been my students and postdocs who have really cracked the code on this for me, because it just seemed so intimidating and overwhelming to think about that actually doing theory on here. So I was very surprised that we've come up with actually a fair bit of elegant theory in the end around it, but still not enough to fully solve all the problems. Okay, so let me keep going now. All right, so just to get a sense for this experiment then, what we actually did in this experiment, the one that I started with, this boot warning parking fines experiment, we ran an experiment where we used an adaptive experiment. We used a modified Thompson sampling algorithm, ensuring a minimum number of observations was allocated the control, because we did anticipate that we would want to show afterwards that our treatment was better than the control. And we wanted enough data on the control to be able to compare it, even though the control was expected to be bad. And so we had a bunch of different treatments, different kinds of formats of the email, different actions, different ways of expressing how you're at risk, different ways of personalizing the experiments. And then at the top picture is what we had after the first batch, where we had pure randomization. And so you can see that of course, there's a little bit of heteroscedasticity because the variance depends on the mean. But overall, we have similar variances across the different arms because we had been allocating the same number to each arm. But by the end of the experiment, we have, some arms, like this maroon arm has a pretty wide spread. We figured out pretty quickly that was a bad arm and didn't allocate as much data to it, while there's a couple of leading arms. And so that's how the experiment looked at the end, where it looked like there were two that were pretty similar, couldn't tell them much apart. And they had been getting progressively more data as we got to the end of the experiment. After the experiment, we picked two treatments and ran them against the control in a larger experiment, a larger purely randomized experiment. For a variety of reasons, we couldn't do exactly what we did in the pilot phase, and that was disappointing because it would have been like kind of a test of all of this. But we did see in the end that in the final purely randomized RCT with 22,000 actual New York City drivers, that the prototypes were both better than the control. So we kind of called that a success of the adaptive experiment. Now, even looking at this, you might ask, well, did we actually design the perfect experiment if our plan was to pick two and run them? And the answer is no. Actually, Thompson sampling is not the right algorithm to use if this had been our plan. Thompson sampling is designed to maximize the utility of the people in the experiment, but we actually cared about the value of the arms we chose as we left the experiment. So we didn't design this optimally. And actually, if you want to really know the reason why we didn't, is because we were given like a very short time frame to test this and plan it. And we had the Thompson sampling, well debugged, and we just didn't have time to really go further and try other algorithms and see what difference they would make. But actually, in our paper that we wrote up about this, we showed afterwards, we simulated data and found that actually it just turns out that Thompson sampling did pretty well in terms of achieving our objectives. So I've been talking about objectives now, so let me talk about that a little bit more. So regret, again, is the machine learning term for the difference between the average outcomes we would have observed under optimal assignment and the average outcomes we actually observe under a given assignment algorithm. So if the best prototype gives us a 90% click-through rate on average, and a different one gives us 40% rate on average, then the regret from assigning the suboptimal arm would be that gap between them. And so low average regret means the algorithm is getting close to optimal performance. So this is, of course, unobserved in an application. Like we don't know at the end of a experiment exactly what the values of all the arms are. But the goal of achieving low average regret is sort of what we're often optimizing for and what we're studying theoretically when we compare different algorithms. So that's what the theory focuses on. And most of the theory focuses on guarantees about regret. So it's trying to say, you know, I'm going to guarantee that the regret is bounded by something. Another type of goal would be learning. And that's actually what we wanted to do in the New York City experiment. There, the main purpose of an experiment might be to learn for the future. And in many economics and social science settings, we're actually running an experiment because we want to learn about the future. So regret is not necessarily the right concept for us, or it's not that commonly the right concept for us as social scientists. But then the question is, well, what is it that you want to learn about? Do you want to learn about the best arm? Do you want to test that the best arm is better than the control? And you actually have to think, really, as I mentioned earlier, you have to think about the context you're in. Are there costs involved? Like, what is the decision that's being made at the end of this experiment? And sometimes there can be multiple objectives. Usually there's multiple objectives. So I'm working on a adaptive experiment for providing input about contraceptive choice in Africa. And so, you know, one objective is that, well, we care about the people in the experiment and we want to be ethical. A second thing is that we want to show policymakers afterwards. In that case, we're experimenting on both discounts and the way information is presented. We would like to be able to show policymakers that it's not just a spurious finding, that actually, you know, some of these treatments work better than others. If giving discounts costs money, you know, we want to know how much. So we have multiple objectives in planning the experiment, and that's where experiment planning for a social scientist can get really complicated. One of the things that I really underestimated myself in my lab is just how overwhelming it was to plan a adaptive experiment when you have multiple objectives, because at that point the theory doesn't guide you and there are trade-offs. I mean, the theory guides your ideas, but the theory doesn't tell us exactly what to do, and there are trade-offs. And so we end up having to run a lot of simulations to get a sense of what the trade-offs will be as we plan the experiment. You know, another way that comes up, and of course, as we continue to be in a pandemic, these issues have come up a lot. Is like things like in clinical trials, dropping harmful arms. So, you know, how do we economize on learning about drugs? One big inefficiency, especially in the first year of the pandemic, was that we had a whole bunch of people testing the same drugs over and over again, rather than having a coordinated clinical trials where, as the evidence started to accumulate that, you know, say chloroquine or something like that doesn't work, that we would put less patients there and put more patients into things that looked like they had a better prospect of working. So those are they're different objectives in different settings. So again, I talked about the Thompson sampling. Again, the Thompson sampling, we assign treatments according to the probability, the posterior probability that an arm is best. And again, the intuition is that the more confident we are that they're best, you know, the better it is on average to assign to that. But if we have uncertainty, we want to continue to gather data until that uncertainty is resolved. Another type of allocation, one that would have made more sense for my boot warming experiment, is something that Max Casey and Soutman in an Econometrica paper called exploration sampling. And in exploration sampling, they were trying to basically maximize the value of the arm that's chosen at the end of the experiment. So I really wanted to have a good email to send, and so I should have used exploration sampling to try to maximize the value of the arm at the end of the experiment. And what they show is, under some conditions, something that does well for that objective is to use, instead of the probability that you're best, use p times 1 minus p. And then you have to normalize so the probabilities add up to 1. So instead of just assigning in proportion to one arm is best, you assign in proportion to p times 1 minus p. So just to think about what that means, if you're down to 2 arms, then p times 1 minus p is going to be the same for both arms. So it's going to, if you end up with just 2 arms alive at the end, you're going to just do pure randomization between those. And that makes sense, because if I really care about the value of what's left, then to minimize the variance, I should keep bouncing back and forth between those 2 arms, gathering data on both of them, just so I can make sure I learn which one is better. But leading at the very beginning of an experiment, where all the arms look the same, it's going to look more like Thompson sampling, and it's very similar to Thompson sampling, along the way, but it's just a little bit less aggressive, a little more emphasis on exploration, because the future is important, and a little bit less on exploitation. And so going back a minute to this, to our adaptive experiment we ran on the emails, it turns out when we did simulations later, we ended up kind of doing almost the same with exploration sampling as we did with Thompson sampling. And that just has to do with this particular DGP and where we ended up, because we had these 2 that were similar. So Thompson sampling hadn't made any mistakes yet, and it was still kind of sampling the top 2 arms, pretty, it was still doing a fair bit of exploration around the best arms. But in general, they could be different. These could be very different in principle, but they turn out they align pretty well. They weren't very different in our setting. So we didn't screw up too badly by the fact that we ran out of time to test, to debug the exploration sampling. Another algorithm that's commonly used is something called upper confidence bounds. Now, it turns out as an econometrician, I really don't like this one because it has deterministic allocations. And the fact that things are deterministic can make a lot of math very messy. But for other types of math that it's used, these things actually can be easier to analyze. So the upper confidence bound, it has a similar idea in the sense that it's factoring in both the means and the variances of arms. But in the case of upper confidence bounds, you deterministically pick the arm where the upper end of a confidence interval around its mean is the highest. So in this case here, I'm showing 2 arms, the arm 1 and arm 2. The dots are the sample means to date, and these bars are the error bars around them. Because the red bar has the highest upper limit of the confidence interval, for the next batch, you would pick entirely arm 1. But if I had made this blue bar a little bit wider, even if it had a lower mean, you would deterministically pick arm 2. And so if you have something that's really noisy and you haven't gathered any data about it yet, then it's going to have really wide confidence intervals, and you're going to pick that one. So you kind of sequentially go arm to arm to arm, dumping data on them to shrink their confidence intervals until you find the best one. So it turns out that UCB and Thompson sampling have similar kinds of guarantees in terms of regret. And so the first approximation to this was that, well, sometimes one does better, sometimes another does better at regret, but there's not a clear winner. But then as you get into more details and nuances of this literature, it can matter more, and it can certainly matter a lot for the ability to prove theorems. When I come to contextual bandits, UCB I think is particularly problematic. So if you're interested in this, you can check out our Shiny app. We have a little R app that we wrote where you can, and let me know if you have any trouble accessing this. But I just tested it a little earlier today to make sure it was still up and running. And here, what this allows you to do is run simulations of bandit experiments. So you can decide what kind of data collection you want to use, random, Thompson sampling. Epsilon greedy is another algorithm where you choose what looks best most of the time, but then you uniformly experiment the rest of the time. It's got these different slider bars for different ways you can do this. You can figure out how many arms you want and just run some simulations and see how these things work. And that can help you build some intuition for the different algorithms and how they work. So one thing you can do and generate this if you play with it is that you can see that there are certain edge cases where these algorithms can have certain drawbacks. And one thing is that they're often actually a little bit unstable, and they also can become convinced, or they can convince you that they've figured out one arm is definitely the best, even if that arm is not definitely the best. And I won't be able to get into all the details today, but you actually kind of have to stretch your brain in a couple different directions to think about this. But even though one of the things that confused me at first was like, how can this, I've got a Bayesian algorithm here. How can it be really sure that arm 1 is better than arm 2 if arm 1 is really not better than arm 2? How can a Bayesian algorithm be convinced of something that's false? But on average, if you run a lot of simulations and you have lots of periods of time, it's actually expected that sometimes this Bayesian thing will be convinced that something is true that's not true. So it's not actually a mistake per se. Now there's edge cases. And so this is a particular picture of what happens in an arm where the arms are exactly equally good. And these are assignment probabilities over time. And so I'm using Thompson sampling here. So the assignment probability is proportional to the probability that you think an arm is good. And you see that there are a lot of cases here where the bandit gets confused and thinks that one arm is better than the other arm, even though they're actually equally good. And it dumps the other arm. And it might never figure out its mistake if you don't put some constraints on how low probabilities can go. So this is a pretty common scenario. And actually the instability of bandits is one of the things that makes them a real pain. So let me pause there. Any questions on that?
You kind of discussed your example kind of also in the setting of having first the pilot, and then you have the period where you did the Thompson sampling for actually testing out the different arms. That feels in principle similar to also how, say, many development experiments might go, that you first run some kind of pilot where you try to figure out what questions to ask or how to frame something and so forth, and then you do kind of the kind of actual study later on. Do you think in principle it can be essentially applied more or less in the same ways in those settings as well? Where I think currently people end up kind of just after the pilot more often just picking one instead of after the pilot having some slightly more dynamic one where they do multiple different arms that they still try out. And then can you also do something similar to power calculations for this, or is that just extremely messy to figure out what kind of sample sizes you would need if you are not in a setting where just the city of New York tells you can do this for a month and then we need to know?
Great questions. So in my lab, we have moved so when I originally started thinking about this, I thought when I started running my own experiments, there's an enormous amount of human time, and you spend all this time in a room, like in a conference room, staring at it like a screen or a whiteboard and saying, oh, well, I like this thing, I like that thing. And then you go out and you maybe do a bit of a pilot, and then you come back and you argue again. So it can take months to get something launched, just because if you have a budget of a certain amount and you're just trying to figure this out, you're putting this high stakes on getting the answer right. So you're afraid to try different things. And so you just don't explore very much of the space. So the way I thought about it was this was going to sort of substitute, experimental subjects and kind of, experiment running time for the human time, where we were just guessing and making stuff up anyways, and allow yourself to run like one big experiment where the pilot phase would be sort of incorporated in the main experiment. And you would, instead of having to guess and make up stuff about which ones go in and which ones go out and how long the pilot should be and all this stuff, it would be systematic and it would be reproducible. And, hopefully other people will say this today. I usually, if I'm teaching this whole thing, I'll spend a lot of time on this too. They say that one of the big benefits of machine learning into econometrics is that we're going to make everything more reproducible, because we're going to automate certain parts of our problem that we used to kind of do in this very ad hoc way. So that's what I was thinking here. What I'm going to show you in the last part of this tutorial is, though, that actually reusing data from these things and trying to test hypotheses afterwards is very complicated. Now, I think we've sort of solved some of the problems, but I still feel like it's actually a two-stage experiment is more likely to be something successful. And that's where I've been moving towards in my own applied experiments. Like, run a big bandit and, don't make sure the details don't have to be perfect. And you're not necessarily going to reuse the data to test hypotheses, and then have a final phase. It could be pre-planned, but a final phase where you kind of take what you've learned and run like a pure RCT of, say, the best treatment versus control or something else. So that way you have some clean data where you don't have to explain to your reviewers, you don't have to convince yourself, that you haven't screwed anything up, you haven't gotten something wrong, and you have sort of some data that's easier to analyze afterwards. And so that's kind of where I've landed now in terms of what's most practical and what's most likely to result in the researcher having something useful at the end. So basically run a Bandit as your pilot. At some point, either planned or unplanned, stop it, and then run a pure RCT at the end. If you want it to all be one pre-planned thing, then there's a lot of planning involved. If you want to just throw away the data from your Bandit or just show it as like in an appendix or something, then you don't have to get everything perfect at the beginning. You can then just run the Bandit and don't have to plan it as carefully, and then be more careful and do your pre-analysis plans and everything else you want to do for the final RCT. So that's probably the easiest path, what I just described. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about 2 more ideas, and so I'm not going to go over all the slides I have here actually, but I'm going to leave some of them behind for you with some details. But I want to get a couple of 2 different ideas. One is I want to talk about what are the problems with reanalyzing data, and then second, I want to talk about contextual bandits and personalization. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, we may face trade-offs between different objectives. So low regret during the experiment means we want to be adaptive, but afterwards, if we want to form test hypotheses or have well-powered hypotheses or valid confidence intervals, those may be in conflict with doing an adaptive experiment. So as we learn more about how to achieve each individual objective, that then in turn can help us make these trade-offs. So one of the big problems I mentioned is that in an adaptive experiment, the data you collected are not independent. And it turns out that usual methods for inference will give wrong answers, and you need more sophisticated methods. So one of the papers we have came out in PNAS this year that shows how to do this. But for this tutorial, I want to focus mostly on building intuition for what goes wrong, because that can help you actually just understand the whole problem. So let's consider a simple experiment. There are 2 arms, and each arm has the same expected value of 0. And the data is collected adaptively in 2 batches. In the first half, we assign 50% probability to each arm. Then at the end of that batch, we estimate the sample means. And then in the second batch, we assign the arm with the highest estimated mean 90% of the time. Okay? And so, suppose our goal is to estimate the value of each arm and produce a valid confidence interval for it. Now, if that was our goal, we wouldn't have designed the experiment this way, but this is for illustration to build intuition. Okay? So how do we use this data to figure out the value of each arm if this is how we collected it? Well, the first idea is, well, what happens if you use the sample mean? What if I just average up arm 1 and arm 2 and use that as my estimator? So this is what I'm showing in this picture is from simulations of doing that over and over again. And we see that our collected data has a mean less than 0 for each arm, and it's not normal. It's my distribution of sample means from running this over and over again for any particular arm are not normal. So why is that? What's going wrong? Well, what happens is with these 2 equal arms, so after the first batch, one of the arms has to be low and one of the arms has to be high. But if you happen to be the low arm in the first batch, you're not going to gather a lot of data in the second batch. And so if you were low in the first batch, then you're averaging up a low mean, the minimum order statistic of 2 means in the first batch with a small amount of additional data. So on average, that's going to still be low. If you were low in the first batch and you throw a few more observations on top of it, you're still going to be low. So the sample means when the arm was smaller in the first batch are substantially less than 0. While if you were larger in the first batch, on average, you're averaging something that was high, but then you're going to gather a lot more data. And so that's going to pull you back towards 0 because you gathered more data, and eventually the effect of having been in the highest in the first batch is small. So so if the 2 arms are equal, then there's equal chance of each. So actually, the distribution of sample means at the end of the experiment is a mixture of two distributions, one of which is substantially below zero, and the other one is a little bit above zero. And so you end up with this non-normal distribution, and you can have bad confidence intervals. Okay. So, and again, when I first started doing this, I thought, oh, this isn't going to be that big a deal. It's all going to go away. But then we did simulations, and we kept getting bad coverage of confidence intervals, and realized I started with some contextual bandits, and I went back to simple bandits and found out, no, this isn't, it's not a bug. You know, this is really something that it can be important quantitatively. So the second idea then is, okay, now I don't want to use pure sample means. I'm going to use inverse propensity weighting. Now, this can be really confusing because there's no context here. There's no X's. So you're used to the idea of a propensity score being a function of X. Here, the propensity score is just a function of time. So ET of W is the assignment probability for arm W at time T. But what you do is you basically upweight observations in periods of time where an arm was pulled less often. So going back to our previous experiment here, if we think about the way that this data was collected, in the second batch, one of the arms would be pulled only 10% of the time. But we would divide by that probability to upweight those observations. And what it basically is equivalent to doing is saying, in this second batch, I'm going to take sample averages. And I'm going to equally weight the sample averages from the second batch with the sample averages from the first batch. So the problem before was that I had a low arm, and then I just threw in a few more observations on it. But now I'm going to upweight those future observations. So now I'm going to get back to something unbiased. So it seemed like this should be the solution. And this is what a lot of the literature had started coming towards is, well, as long as I just equally weight each batch for each arm, or equivalently divide by the propensity scores, then I'm going to get something that's unbiased. But we were doing simulations with those and still not getting right coverage of confidence intervals. And that was where the insight for the PNAS paper came. We realized that this was not going to be normal either. And it also is high variance, because what we're doing is we're running an experiment where we're trying to drop bad arms. We're trying to throw away and not give a lot of observations to bad arms. So those propensity scores are getting really small and the variance is exploding. So what we did instead, and I'll just maybe show you here sort of what the solution looks like. What we did is we said, instead of just averaging up propensity weighting, first of all, we are going to stabilize things by using something that's closer to what's called AIPW scores in the econometrics literature, where we're going to add in an estimate of the sample mean, a running estimate of the sample mean as we go along. And that's gonna put less of an emphasis on the component that's got this small propensity score in the denominator. But the more important thing is that we introduce what we call evaluation weights. And basically, they put more weight on data at the beginning of the experiment and less weight on data at the end of the experiment for arms that look like they're doing badly. And so we do this in an adaptive way, but if you can tell that an arm is on the path to getting thrown away, you start upweighting the observations you have now and downweighting future arms. And this basically stabilizes the variance, and we use martingale theory to show that we can get a good confidence intervals out of that. So this is one of these things where I was really surprised, like, how can you actually get good theory out of this? But actually, we did. So the theorem is about consistency and asymptotic normality of estimators we get using these weights. All right, so let me now spend the last couple minutes, and sorry I ran a little bit out of time here, but I'm going to want to give you just a little bit of a hint about contextual bandits, which is the whole thing that made this interesting to me to start with. I wanted to learn optimal treatment assignment policies. So the idea is you want to learn a policy pie that maps from individual characteristics to treatments. So now, instead of just having each unit being identical, I'm imagining a unit's going to arrive with characteristics. So now I'm trying to learn a function. Now that's really hard, but it's also one reason bandits might be helpful, frankly, because you're trying to learn a function. Like for every X, you're trying to learn the best arm. That sounds super hard. A purely randomized experiment sounds like maybe, we would be way underpowered and we would never figure anything out. So it might be especially important to use bandits to try to make sure that I'm getting the right treatment for the right person. So just to give an example of what this looks like, over here on the left, the pictures are these outcome models. So the two axes, the horizontal axes here are two contexts, and then the vertical axis is the outcome. So we've got three outcomes: the red arm, the yellow arm, and the blue arm. We see the blue arm is good for low values of this X1 here and X2, while the red arm is good for high values of X1 and X2. And the yellow is kind of flat, and the blue is optimal for low and bad for the high. And so what I've pictured on the right is what happens to the data out to the allocation of units as we go through different batches. So in the beginning, after just gathering a little bit of data, we're going to allocate, according to this picture. Then in the second picture, we think that the yellow arm is best, so we allocate the yellow arm a lot of the time. Then as we move on through, we start learning what the best policy is, which is to have blue in the low and red in the high. So that's kind of how this works. One of the approaches, and the approach that's used here in these pictures, how did we figure out what the probability should be? We use an outcome modeling approach. So after each batch, you estimate a model mapping user characteristics to outcomes for each treatment. So K would be the batch, mu hat is my estimated outcome model. It depends on which arm I'm looking at, W. So here W would be yellow, green, blue, and X would be the characteristics. Okay. So what we're going to try to do is after each batch, learn the true kind of structural model of the world, and then come up with the best treatment assignments. We're going to use something like Thompson sampling heuristics. So each time an X comes up, I plug it into my models. I say, what's the probability that yellow arm is the best given this X? And I pull the yellow arm in proportion to that probability. So I just do Thompson sampling for each X as they arrive, given that I have a Bayesian model of my outcomes. Now, what are some things that can go wrong here? Well, it turns out functional forms can be a really big problem. So this is like the classic selection or confoundedness problems you learn about in econometrics, except for that we created these problems when we ran the experiment. So I've kind of drawn a picture of a cross section. X is on the horizontal axis, and I'm looking at how my conditional means for arm 1 and arm 2, or for the blue arm and the red arm. And so I can see that I'm going to I could figure out what that shape of those functional forms look like from purely randomized data, although it might be noisy. But after the first batch, I say, hey, the red arm is good when X is high, and the blue arm is good as X is low. So if you look at the right picture here, now I'm going to start collecting a lot of data for the red arm with the high X's, and I collect a lot of data for the blue arm with the low X's. And you can see the slope of the outcome model is flatter when for the red arm when the X's are high, and it's flatter for the blue arm when the X's are low. So if you just sort of fit a model through there, you're going to have a biased estimate of the outcome models. And so that can lead you to make mistakes in your allocation later. So this is just this problem is just the same problem we would have in any kind of observational study with confoundedness, but here I've created the problem. So what's the natural thing to do? Well, this paper that I'm showing you here in AAAI proposed using doubly robust estimation in the process of the Bandit algorithm itself. So trying to use the techniques we knew from causal inference, basically having the agent inside the Bandit should be a agent who understands the problems of observational studies and causal inference. And surprisingly, like a lot of the AI literature had just ignored that. Most of it had ignored that previously. So that's just like one of the many problems. And you can see this starts getting very complicated when you're doing these contextual bandits, because now you have to think about the functional forms. So, just to give a little summary, and I know I'm just about out of time, but just to give a little summary then of like a causal inference perspective to these contextual bandit algorithms, we're trying to deal with the fact that functional form assumptions lead to bias, but also searching for the right functional form can slow down learning. So some of the different things are to make the Bandit smarter, again, using doubly robust estimation, and also to have data-driven functional form choices. So there's a couple of approaches that have been used historically. One is like sequential search. So you're searching over functional forms sequentially. Another approach is to search over functional forms in parallel. And so with Sanath Krishnamurthy, who's a PhD student here, and Vitor Haddad, who's a postdoc, we have a working paper now that's under revision where we show how you can use some ideas from basic supervised machine learning to pick the functional forms. And something that's kind of interesting about it is that when you don't have much data, the bias variance trade-off makes you want to choose a simple model. While later on, when you have lots of data, the bias variance trade-off makes you want to choose a complex model. And so actually we show that you don't have to waste a lot of energy exploring, because if you use data-driven model selection and you realize you don't know the functional form, the learning will kind of go at an appropriate rate by using cross-validation to choose your models. You'll choose simple models at the beginning and more complex models later, and that natural evolution is actually good enough to get to avoid biases and to get a good outcome. So that's my very, very latest on this. And then a couple of other working papers, or one of them just came out in ICML. We also show other ways to evaluate policies if you've run contextual bandits, as well as estimate the best targeted treatment assignment policies after running bandits. So we finally got some theory on these. So these last couple of questions, like how do I use a bandit and then estimate a policy afterwards? That's like where I started 5 years ago. Turned out it was harder than I thought. We finally, I think, got close to good answers. But these issues are definitely not settled, and there's lots of active research going on here all the time. There's lots of papers in 2021 getting written about this. So with that, let me stop, and then I guess I don't know, we're supposed to have a social hour next, right? So I don't know if I should take questions here or.
Yeah, so I would propose we just take a few more minutes to see whether there are any questions left on the talk before stopping the stream and taking a short break.
Great.
Noam, do you want to ask your question from earlier?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so fascinating. One question I had was, what happens when there's a fixed sample and the treatment varies by dosage? Is there sort of a cost of reserving units for future adaptive assignment, and how to trade that off? Yeah, any thoughts around that? Because my understanding from the email example was it's sort of a once-off dosage, but let's say tutoring, which like every hour really counts and helps the kid learn and improves the effect size. Do you want to withhold kids from getting tutoring to get the optimal allocation later once you get more information from, let's say, the half subset?
Yeah, thanks, Noam. That's a great question. And actually, that also relates to a question that I didn't finish answering from Michael earlier as well about just like dynamics. So I answered about instability, but not about dynamics. So I would say that the problem you're interested in, I'm also very interested in, but it's not really fully solved. So the part of AI and machine learning that would be better equipped to answer your question would be reinforcement learning, because with reinforcement learning, it's basically the same as bandits, except you have a state variable. So reinforcement is like the kind of AI that teaches a robot to climb a wall, or teaches like a robot to play Pac-Man or something, where there's in the physical world, like there's a state variable that says, where are you on the wall, and where are your arms and legs, or which ghosts are going to come and eat you in Pac-Man, right? So there's a state variable about the game. But then given a state, which is kind of like a context in what I've showed you here, then you still have these exploitation trade-off. So the world, I know I'm not fully answering your question, but just to start by like, when things get dynamic in general, that's called reinforcement learning. And only relatively recently have people really been bringing in what I would think of as well-founded statistics into the agents inside of reinforcement learning. One of my colleagues here at Stanford, Emma Brunskill, who actually works on education as one of her main application areas, has been collaborating with Stefan Wager and others to try to bring in better statistics into the agents inside of these reinforcement learning algorithms. Short answer is it's a hard problem. This one other literature that relates to your question is what I mentioned. I've been working with a postdoc who's now going to be a professor at Emory, Roshan Zhuang. And her thesis was about designing sort of staggered rollout experiments. And there's a little bit of similarity where you can sort of turn on a treatment and it's costly to turn it off again. So you might be wanting to roll out tutoring, over different students throughout the semester because you're trying to understand about time effects. And then in extensions of that work, you might want to add additional doses. So you might want to decide, how to add those. So I'm sorry, again, I don't have a clean answer. There's not one paper that I think really solves this problem, but I would love to solve it. But it's kind of one step at the time. I had to go backwards from the contextual bandits to the simple bandits to even get to the hypothesis testing. So.
Sammy, would you also like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much for the talk. My question was, so I was very convinced by the adaptive experiments, and then the chart about the instability was a tad concerning. So I was just wondering, how is that sort of an edge case that just doesn't occur very often? And are you hopeful that different types of algorithms will solve that problem, or is that sort of always going to be an issue with adaptive experiments?
So I still work with a fair number of private sector companies that use these things. And I think one of the biggest complaints that they have is also that they tend to be unstable and kind of go to suboptimal things and stick there. So there's a few just easy workarounds, which is that you try to avoid dumping arms, or you make your experimentation more experiment, less exploiting. The exploration sampling will also do that. It's a little hard to know about how to think about these edge cases when you have a lot of things that are very noisy and very similar in value, which might be the case in a lot of behavioral experiments. That's where you hopefully won't do terribly, because you're going to keep collecting data about the arms you think are good. And so if something really isn't very good, you're eventually going to figure out that it's not very good. But you have to be a lot more cautious about drawing conclusions about the things that you dumped being bad if you haven't collected that much data about them. Which is partly why I have, in my more behavioral experiments where we do have low treatment effects, and this noise is a really big issue. And of course, I've got limited budget, so I'm always pushing up against the budget constraint. We do plan a phase at the end. If there's a hypothesis that's really important to me, then I make sure that I collect some clean, non-adaptive, purely randomized data to establish that hypothesis.
I think Lindsay also has a question that kind of relates to the last point you talked about. Lindsay, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it's very related. I was asking about such similar situations where experimentation is very costly. How do you think about training a contextual bandit? Do you try to train it online, or what's the best way to think about that?
Yeah, so I think if experimentation is very costly, then trying to find another population to start with. And, there's sort of, and actually I didn't get to my conclusion slide, and I actually still don't know how to write the conclusion for this, which is a source of frustration for me, but that's why I'm teaching you guys. You guys will maybe figure it all out all the things I haven't been able to. But I really like to understand things. I want to stand here today and say, this is when you use one, and this is when you don't. And this is when you're going to have value, and this is when you're not. And if I don't understand that, I make myself crazy. But I feel like we still don't fully understand when you use them and when you don't. A few things though, actually that I didn't mention already, it is important that errors aren't too costly, because you are going to be often you're going to be trying a lot of different things. The engineering interface is really important, because if you're having an algorithm, if you have to call an algorithm to know what your probabilities are, that actually requires a lot of cost, a lot of engineering costs. So the way that we often implement these in practice, whether I'm running them or I'm collaborating with a firm, is that we just upload some probabilities, or if it's segments or subgroups, upload the segments and the subgroups and the probabilities, run it as a pure RCT with those probabilities, a stratified RCT, then gather the data, run something offline, and then upload new probabilities. Because if you actually try to build an algorithm that's being called in real time, that can create a lot of complexity, even like for a very big tech firm. They don't want to slow down the page load of their web page. But in general, these things can go wrong. It can be hard to plan if you only have one shot. And so we often do a lot of simulations ahead of time. So I sort of thought I was cutting out human time because we can try all these different treatments, but then we've substituted it with a lot of human time to run simulations to kind of see, is the Bandit going to work and all of this stuff. So I think eventually, as we get better at running the simulations and kind of build better intuition, we can get the best of both worlds, less human time planning the experiment and less human time designing the treatments. But at the moment, I definitely have not hit that optimum, and we still find it difficult and cumbersome to run these things. So I would say if you're like in an expensive kind of high stakes environment, this may not be the best place to get started with these things, frankly. Now, sometimes the stakes can be really high, like we want to learn about COVID treatments fast or something. Then, maybe it's worth it to put the effort into planning and to try to get to a good answer quickly.
And I'm not sure how we are doing on time, if you should let people have their break and continue the discussion later, or keep going with
I would say let's do exactly that. So let's thank Susan. Susan, this was great. And I want to remind people who are watching on the live stream that our next live stream will be tomorrow at 11 a.m. Chicago time, which will be Viktor Chernozyukov.